It's the largest collection of paintings by Max Beckmann in the world. We have 39 paintings here. We have around 350 prints. Beckmann was a great printmaker. So, you know, this really, if anywhere in the world to see Max Beckmann, this is the place. The main reason for that is a collector called Morton May, who is the largest private collector of Beckmann's work. When Beckmann came to St. Louis in the late 1940s, he met Morton May. He painted Morton May's portrait, so they had a relationship. And he bequeathed his collection to the St. Louis Art Museum in 1983. First major retrospective of Beckmann's work in America. It took place here in 1948. Beckmann, for me, is the greatest German painter of the 20th century. He's an artist who, throughout his career, was always searching for new modes of painting, of printmaking, of sculpture. He experimented in all of those areas. And the Sinking of the Titanic here is really one of his most ambitious paintings, certainly in terms of scale. This is a work which measures 8.5 feet high by 11 feet wide. What you can see here is essentially the struggle for survival of these figures who are in the various lifeboats. The Titanic you can see in the distance against this kind of iron red sky. And then kind of beyond that, just the wonderful colors that the Beckmann creates in the water in particular, the yellows, the reds, the golds here. And then the figures who, as you start to look more closely at the painting, start to emerge. So for example here, you can see a figure of a drowning man whose head, kind of rather ghostly head, just appears out of the water. The painting has a kind of power to it which I think is in many ways largely due to Beckmann's composition. He chose to actually set his horizon very high up, you know, almost right at the top of the painting. And because of that, one has almost a sensation that the boats are tumbling out of the composition. It really adds to the kind of disorienting, kind of nightmarish quality that I think he was aiming for in this composition. His work, particularly in the 1920s, is his kind of social commentary. It deals with the atmosphere in Germany, particularly after World War I, the sense of depression, of desolation during that period. Max Beckmann's Christ and the Woman Taken in Adultery was painted in 1917. It's a painting which really speaks to human cruelty, human barbarism, the kind of subjects that Beckmann had experienced in World War I and which have deeply affected him. So what you see in this painting here is that a woman is being stoned by a mob. And then in the center of the composition, you have the figure of Christ, who's protecting the woman. Interestingly, the face of Christ is actually modeled on that of Beckmann himself. One of the interesting things in Beckmann's work is to try to spot Beckmann in his other paintings, because he's often kind of hiding himself within more religious or mythological scenes. He'll represent himself as a king or as Christ indeed. So he's a man a little bit like Picasso, who had this very strong ego, but in a way that is what makes him a great artist. It's what separates him from other figures. And it's interesting to see that there have been a lot of exhibitions recently of Beckmann's work, and people are, which would never have been the case 10 years ago, that people are starting to talk about Beckmann in the same kind of breath as a Picasso or a Matisse. He was extremely popular in the 1920s. He had a very secure patron base. What you see in the 1930s as the Nazis come to power is that starts to disappear. His work is declared degenerate. He's declared a cultural Bolshevik. And by 1937, Beckmann is leaving Germany. He's going into exile. His work is in the Degenerate Art Exhibition in Germany in 1937. But he spends the years from 1937 to 47 in Amsterdam. So this is Acrobats. This is the third of Beckmann's 9 completed triptychs, painted in 1939. Beckmann was always fascinated by the circus, and what you see here are a group of circus performers. You've got 3 different areas within the circus. To the left here is the circus arena, so you can see figures on a tightrope here, you can see a trapeze artist at the top. In the center, you have a kind of behind-the-scenes view. This is a dressing room with a number of performers who are getting ready to perform. For example, you have a snake charmer here on the right. And then in the right-hand triptych, you have the entrance foyer to the circus. You can see the ice cream cellar on the left. These are a couple of clowns here who are drinking champagne. And then the figure at the top right is a performer dressed as Mars, the Roman god of war. And this, for Beckmann was a reference to, to the wider historical context, the fact that this painting was painted around the onset of World War II. I like to imagine that, Beckmann loved the circus, and he saw it as a kind of sanctuary, a place of retreat, of liberation, and that idea was particularly resonant at this moment when he was surrounded by horror, with the onset of World War II, but he still found a kind of sense of sanctuary in the circus. Beckmann, for me, is a great colorist, and that color becomes more and more evident in his late work. So you see these paintings which, where the figures are framed by these wonderful dark black lines, almost like stained glass, and within those lines you have these incandescent colors, canary yellows, wonderful turquoises, bright scarlet reds, and that is part of the appeal of Beckmann, just on a purely visceral level. And this painting has a particularly poignant aspect to it for me. It was shown at the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 1950. Beckmann was in New York at that time, went to see the painting. It was while he was actually crossing Central Park that he had a heart attack and died. You can trace a kind of dark vision and a fairly pessimistic view of the world in a lot of these works. Having said that, even though he never subscribed to a particular religion, there is a kind of what you might call a sort of spiritual underpinning to his work. He talked about trying to render the invisible visible in his paintings. So, that interest in the spiritual, I think, lends a slightly more optimistic element to his work, which does counterbalance the pessimism that you can see in his view of society. As we've reconceptualized, rethought the collection and reinstalled it in what we've called the new view, we decided to make Max Beckmann really front and center. So in this gallery in which we're standing, this is really the kind of centerpiece of this new view project. So we wanted to celebrate that and foreground it in a way which we haven't done before.